I'm joined now by the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray, the MP for Ealing North, who joins me from College Green. Lovely to see you, Mr Murray. I don't think we've spoken on the show before, so welcome. Thank you. Can we kick off? I know you want to talk about pensions, and we'll get onto that in just a moment, but can we just kick off by discussing the independent pay review body suggesting this 5.5% pay rise for NHS workers and teachers? Labour have allowed for 3%. Will they move to 5.5%?
So there's a process that we need to go through over the next few weeks, and what the Chancellor has set out is that she is looking at the pay review body's recommendations, and she'll come to Parliament before the end of July to set out her response to them, and that will be in the context of public finances and the public spending inheritance that we have in government, because we know that the public finances are in the worst state since the Second World War. The Chancellor asked Treasury officials in her first days in office to do a thorough assessment of them, and that will be the context in which she'll provide an update to Parliament by the end of the month.
It's going to be really difficult for the Chancellor, though, to go against the independent pay review body when I remember countless occasions where Labour, when they were in the shadow cabinet, kept on talking about the importance of following the recommendations of the independent pay review body. So now you're in government, you're going to change that stance?
Well, there's a process, as I set out, and the Chancellor is looking at those pay review body recommendations. We know, obviously, that the response to those recommendations will involve a cost, but there is also a cost to not striking a deal, because if you don't strike a deal, you run the risk of more industrial action. There are problems in terms of recruitment and retention, and so there's a cost to that too. But all of this will be set out in the next couple of weeks before the end of July in Parliament.
But there's always going to be a cost of potential industrial action. That's how the unions operate. I mean, of course there's always a cost. That doesn't mean you have to do what they demand, even if they threaten you with strike action.
Well, as I say, the Chancellor has been very clear that she's looking at the pay review body's recommendations, and the process that she will lead over the next couple of weeks is to look at those recommendations, to consider the assessment by Treasury officials of the true state of public finances and public spending inheritance, and then set out her response to Parliament before the end of July.
What's your personal view, though? Do you think that NHS workers and indeed hard-working teachers deserve 5.5 or 3%?
Well, my personal view, and that of many of us in Parliament, is that we hugely value the contribution and the work that NHS workers have been doing, that teachers are doing, that police officers are doing across the public sector. In terms of the process for deciding our response to the pay review body's recommendations, I think it's not fair for me to say one thing or the other now when there's a process in train. And what the important thing for me to say is to support that process and say, look, let's let this process play out. It's only a couple of weeks until the Chancellor will make a statement to Parliament, and she'll set out her response to those recommendations in light of the public finances.
OK. You're making the case this morning that the new pensions bill, which was announced in the King's speech, will boost pension pots by over £11,000. How is that, Mr Murray? How will that happen?
So what we're setting out today is the impact that our reforms will have, both in terms of improving returns for pension savers, for pensioners, as well as boosting economic growth, because we know that by the end of this decade, there will be around £800 billion of assets in defined contribution pensions. Now, we want to see that money working harder for pensioners, making sure that pensioners are getting the best possible return that they can, and that it's also more of it is invested in productive activities in the UK economy to help get economic growth up across the UK more generally. So our focus is very much on improving returns for pensioners who saved hard throughout their life, make sure they get the best possible returns on their pension savings, whilst also making sure those assets are invested in things which help the economy to grow, which benefits all of us across the UK. OK, can you rule out further taxation on state pensions under a Labour government? Well, look, the Chancellor will obviously set out all tax policy at the budget in the proper way, but we know that we've inherited a situation where the tax burden is at its highest in 70 years. We know that the previous government introduced freezes to personal allowances, which are increasing taxation on many people. We know that the tax burden is something that we want to be lower, but we are never going to promise any tax cuts or any spending decisions, which we can't say exactly how they would be funded, because we've seen what happens when you make unfunded spending commitments. That's what Liz trusted, that crashed the economy, and that hurt people across the country, and people are still paying the cost now.
OK, so I'm sensing that you can't rule out taxing the state pension further than it is already because of the frozen tax bans. I say that because you have ruled out taxing working people, but there's a clear distinction there, isn't there? Because people who are taking their state pension aren't working people.
No, look, we stand by our commitments that we made in the manifesto around not increasing income tax, national insurance, VAT. Obviously,
what about pensioners
will pay, in some cases, income tax, and pensioners would pay, VAT obviously when they're buying items. Pensioners could pay income tax on their pensions, depending how much pension they're receiving. But we need to level with people and be honest about what we've inherited in terms of the personal allowance freezes, in terms of the dire state of public finances, in terms of the very difficult state of public services. We need to be really clear about that, whilst making sure that we get the economy growing. And actually, to come back to the earlier point you and I were talking about in relation to pension reform, it is about increasing returns for pensioners to make sure they're in a better position in terms of having a higher income when they retire. But it's also about boosting investment, which gets the economy growing, which is so vital to get us out of the doom loop that we've inherited from the previous government.
Just out of interest, how long are you going to be bagging on about the legacy you've inherited? And when will you start taking responsibility for your own fiscal decisions? Just so our audience can know, have we got a year of this, or 2 years, or?
Well, I think that's for the general public to decide, but I think that everyone acknowledged during the election campaign what a difficult inheritance we would have as a result of decisions and failures by the previous government. And I think what we want to be is honest and upfront about that. So when the Chancellor comes to Parliament by the end of the month, as I mentioned earlier, she will set out the true state of public finances that we've inherited. And I think it's really important for us as a new government to be really honest and transparent about what the state of those public finances are, what tough decisions that will entail, whilst also setting out our plan to get the economy growing, to put us in a better position as a country and make people across Britain better off.
While we were talking about pensions, there's a story in the Sunday Telegraph, Mr Murray, about MPs who have been convicted of sex offences and indeed those who are expenses cheats getting their state-funded pensions. Charlie Elphick, for instance, is in line for 22 grand a year. Imran Ahmed Khan could be getting 3 grand a year. Should Keir Starmer step in to stop this? Well,
look, I mean, the actual question about pensions is going to be quite an involved question, I expect. But I think more broadly, when you hear that, you feel that people should be held to higher standards. And actually, one of the things that we made very clear during the election campaign is that we want to improve standards in public life. We want to improve the ethics and behaviour of MPs. And that's something which is very central to our work in government now that we've been elected.
So Starmer should put a stop to it then? If he's all for ethics and holding MPs in a higher regard, he should step in and stop this. Convicted criminals getting taxpayer-funded pensions.
Well, I'm not going to prejudge the specifics of that situation, but the broader
I'm just
point
asking
is
if
very
you think Keir Starmer should step
which
in.
Is that, well, there are specifics that I'm not going to try and work out live on air. But I think the point more generally, which is an important one, is that Keir Starmer has made very clear about the fact that MPs' behaviour and standards in public life have been really damaged in recent years. The perception of MPs has been really damaged as a result of bad behaviour and a lack of integrity amongst many MPs and indeed government ministers in the previous government. Keir Starmer brings a real sense of public service to office and the fact that people should behave absolutely in line with the highest standards of conduct, and that will guide his time in government and our time as a Labour government.
Could the King's speech have been more ambitious on housing, Mr Murray? You set that target of 300,000 new homes a year, but of course that just echoes David Cameron's target of yesteryear.
I think King's speech was incredibly ambitious when it comes to housing. You know, that may well be a target that others have spoken about in the past, but they've never delivered it. And the difference for us is that not only are we setting a target, but we're taking some of the tough decisions to actually make sure it gets delivered when it comes to planning reform, for instance, making sure that those housing targets are set again for local authorities, making sure that we work with local authorities about where to build, about how housing is built, but it's not a question anymore of if housing should be built, because housing has to get built. We have to try and break out of this cycle that we're in now, where people can't afford a home, people can't afford to buy their first home, people are paying expensive rents and they can't look after themselves and their family. We have to break out of this, and that does mean taking tough action.
Why wasn't votes for 16 and 17-year-olds in the King's speech? Have you abandoned that pledge already?
No, it's still a pledge in our manifesto and one that we have in government. But obviously there was, I think, 35, 40 bills in that King's speech. It's a pretty busy King's speech, and there are certain measures we need to get on with really urgently. Whether that's about the asylum and immigration system, whether it's about economic growth, whether it's about the railways. There's plenty of stuff that we need to get on with urgently, and that was what was the focus of the bills in the King's speech.
On that note, when are you going to strip private schools of their VAT status? There's a story in the Sunday Times this morning suggesting that that will kick in January. Can you give us any further details on the timing, please?
Well, look, all the details will be set out by the Chancellor when she speaks in Parliament in the normal way. So we'll see the details about her plans, and obviously in the budget in the autumn there will be further information about across a whole range of policies, but we want to make sure that we're doing the process properly. We will develop our plans that were our manifesto commitments, and then the Chancellor will set out what our approach will be.
Under your new deal for workers, you're hoping to increase the minimum wage. To what?
So the level of the minimum wage is one which is determined by the Low Pay Commission, but what we want to make sure is that the national minimum wage is a real, genuine living wage, and that's why we want to change the remit of the Low Pay Commission to consider the cost of living for the first time. Obviously they will come up with a recommendation based on all of the different factors that they consider and have done for many years, but we think it's important that the cost of living is taken into consideration by them too.
Can you rule out businesses going bust if they can't afford to pay their workers more? Very briefly, Mr Murray.
Well, look, the Low Pay Commission is responsible for making recommendations about what the national minimum wage should be, and they take into consideration a whole range of factors when they set that level. So it's really a decision for them, but it would be for us as a government to make clear what their remit should be.